But yeah, welcome to this very special session about AI. And thank you so much to Alistair for joining us. I can't see anyone in the waiting room, so I think it's a good time just to hand straight over to you, Alistair, if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Sophie. So thanks so much for having me this afternoon. My name's Alistair Small. I'm the Communications and Engagement Lead at DACS, which is the Design and Artist Copyright Society. So I thought I'd start by kind of giving an overview about what DACS is, what DACS does, and why we do it. So DACS is a collective management organization for visual artists, which means that we manage their copyright and protect their copyright. And we also pay them royalties. So we do this through various royalty schemes, some of which are direct licensing. So, for example, we might license the work of an artist for use on a product or in a publication or a book cover, for example. We also pay artists through collective licensing, which is a scheme called Payback, which some of you may be familiar with. But essentially, that's a way for artists to continually receive royalties for their works, which are published in publications and are then reproduced within educational settings. So that's a form of collective licensing, which will actually be quite relevant to some of the conversations that are happening around AI. And we also pay out money through the artist resale right, which is a royalty collected for an artist on the secondary sale of their work within the art market. So if they sell a work to a buyer and then that buyer sells that work on, the artist is then due a secondary royalty. So that's one of DACS's main royalty schemes. And in order to do these things, we do a lot of advocacy work, policy development. We work a lot with the government. Obviously, back in for the artist resale right that came in around 2006. So, we have this long history as an organization of bringing in these new forms of income and remuneration for artists and ensuring that the kind of UK copyright framework works for visual artists. We work a lot across the sector as well. So we work with our colleagues in music. You might be familiar with PRS. So they are the music equivalent of DACS. Obviously, they're much larger than DACS, just because of the scale of the sectors. So we kind of take on this cross-disciplinary role. We work with different organizations within the creative industries around advocacy, particularly focused on intellectual property. And we also run a parliamentary group for the visual arts, which is run with AN and the Contemporary Visual Arts Network, who again you may be familiar with. And that space is where we look kind of more broadly at visual arts sectors. So we look at things like studio provision, affordability of studios, artist pay, contracts, freelance working, etc. So we have a really kind of broad role, but that kind of copyright and intellectual property is the core of what we do. I should also say we're an independent organization, so we're not Arts Council funded. We're funded by our royalty schemes, so completely independent of Arts Council, etc. So I thought it would be helpful with a caveat that I'm not a lawyer, which I think is actually quite helpful because, again, one of the things we do at DACS is we try and sort of translate some of that legal language into language that's accessible for people who aren't lawyers like myself. So here's a very brief overview of copyright law in the UK and how it applies to visual works. So copyright applies to your work as soon as you make it. I think there's perhaps often a misconception that copyright is something that you have to register, which is the case in the US, but in the UK, as soon as you create a work, it's your copyright. You own the copyright for that work. And that's the same for visual works, but also for music, for literary works, audiovisual performances, etc. It lasts for your entire lifetime, and then 70 years after you pass away. It's an exclusive right, which you can transfer the economic rights, but you can't transfer the moral rights. So to transfer all of those economic rights is the way that licensing works, and they tend to be transferred under certain conditions. So you can use this work for X and X only, and this is the fee that's paid for that. So yeah, so this is a fairly top level overview. And again, this is all available on the DACS website, and it's yeah, the wording can be quite sort of legalese, but again, we try and kind of cut through some of that. So and I'll be happy to answer questions about any of this later on as well. So Again, just to say, copyright is a part of a broader suite of rights which fall under intellectual property. So things like trademarks fall within that, database rights, patents, and design rights. But copyright is quite specific and it applies automatically, and it's not time limited in the way that patents are. So to kind of talk a little bit about AI and the work that DACS has been doing in this space. So as you will probably all be aware, AI has been a real kind of topic of conversation across the creative industries, particularly with regards to copyright. You may have seen high profile figures like Elton John, Paul McCartney coming out in support of copyright and against some of the training practices that AI developers are undertaking or allegedly undertaking, but we know that they are probably. So obviously for us, our membership of artists, that's a huge problem for them. The fact that their work could potentially be being scraped, which would be in contravention of existing copyright law, but also anxieties around displacement of work for artists, particularly for commercial artists or illustrators or photographers, for example. So back in about 2 years ago, so in the end of 2023, this is sort of when models like ChatGPT were becoming much more commonplace. Midjourney, for example, the image generating software was becoming something which was now able to generate images which were quite realistic, whereas previously they were sort of they were nowhere near being able to compete with human-made artworks or human-made imagery. So around that time, we thought, okay, we really need to know what our membership think about this. Because as a membership organization, everything we do has to be kind of informed by our members. So we launched a survey into artists' opinions, also actually artists and the state's opinions, attitudes, and experiences of generative AI. We received 1,000 responses to that survey and published in January of 2024. These are some of the kind of key findings that we had from that. So we saw a really high level of concern around people's work being used to train models. So just under 3/4 of the respondents were concerned about that potentially happening. A huge majority wanted to be able to provide or give consent and have control over the use of their work. So, you know, being able to protect their work from training and being able to give consent for training with a license fee paid for it if there is training to take place. But also, interestingly and kind of not surprisingly, almost 90% feeling that the UK government, which at the time was obviously the Conservative government, should bring in kind of greater safeguards and regulation around AI more generally, but specifically around generative AI and large language models, which I appreciate there's a lot of terminology going around here. So if anyone does have any questions about any of these terms, do raise a hand and I can look to address them. Perhaps I should just actually say that, so specifically what we're talking about here is generative AI models. So things like ChatGPT, image generating models. That's something that we've been quite keen to make that distinction in our policy work, is that we know that AI has massive advantages in terms of healthcare, diagnostics, all sorts of things. But there is also this generative AI, which is primarily running in quite an extractive way. And we feel for our membership and for the creative industries has potentially quite damaging effects. And those models are known as large language models. So that's, yeah, if I'm throwing that term out there, that's what that means. So again, just going back to some of those opinions from that survey, we can see there's a huge majority of artists want to be asked, credited, and compensated for any use of their work. Of course they do, as they always would want to. It's their intellectual property, it's their career, it's their creativity. It's very important to all of us as individuals that we have control over our work and our creations, and it's no different with AI, right? And also that interesting that 96% of responses said they hadn't ever given any permission for this training to any AI company. And there's also significant issues around transparency. So a lot of these models are not transparent in terms of how they're working. So, for example, and I'll move on to this shortly, in order to there's a few court cases going through at the moment. The most high profile one is Getty Images, so the image bank. They were taking Stability AI to court to argue that an infringement of their copyright had taken place. The way in which they were able to do that was through prompting the AI to generate something in their style and sort of trying to make that argument. But legally, that's very difficult because there's no transparency over what that training data is. So again, that came through where a huge number of people were not aware if their work had been used. There are various tools that you can use trained. I can send a link around for that, that you can use to see if your images are within some of the data sets that these models use, but not all of them. So from the survey, around 20% were able to identify that their work was in those data sets, but again, the vast majority were not able to determine that. So there's this feeling of these models are reproducing work in the style of artists, but we don't have access to that training data to be able to say this has been trained on my work. Likewise, we looked at skills. So when we think about the kind of pipeline of artistic creation and artistic talent, artists always often use new technologies in their work, whether that's artists who now use the internet to distribute and create their work, or augmented reality and things like that. But we saw that within our membership, a huge majority of them hadn't received training or education in AI, both in terms of using it, but also kind of some of the ethical or legal aspects of using it as well. And that third identified that lack of skills or training as a barrier in using AI in their work. So in terms of the work that we're doing with government, so this actually goes back quite a long way. So I think we've all seen, I think, the recent debates around the copyright and AI consultation that this current government launched, but actually we saw something quite similar launched under the previous Conservative government, which was to introduce the text and data mining exception, which would essentially allow AI developers to undertake this training work that would be made legal within copyright law unless a rights holder opts out their work from that training. So I should say, actually, the original proposal under the Conservative government didn't include that opt-out. So DACS, along with many other organisations, including PRS and those representing authors, performers, etc., publishers, provided lots of evidence on the negative impact of that on the sector, which then led to that proposal being dropped. However, then within this current government, we've kind of seen these ideas resurface. And at the end of last year, the government released its copyright and AI consultation, which proposed 4 options, which I'll go on to in a moment, as well as a kind of broader plan for how the country as a whole is going to sort of make use of some of the opportunities which are presented by artificial intelligence more broadly. So again, we're quite keen to make the distinction. We're not saying artificial intelligence is all bad. We're saying it needs to work ethically, particularly around the sort of content generating AI models. So just to give a little very brief overview of some of the options which were proposed at the end of last year. So first one, do nothing. Obviously we know that these things are happening. So, and there's also very little recourse for artists to address this. So option 0, not really an option. Option 1, strengthen copyright requiring licensing. Obviously for licensing sectors like visual arts, that is what we would want to see. However, we know that there's a big lobby coming from tech saying, we need access to this data. The data copyright law as it is holding back the kind of development of artificial intelligence Option two is sort of very broad data mining exception. So again, without any kind of rights reservation or opt-out mechanism. And then option three, which is what the government stated as its preferred option, which was a exception which would allow AI developers to train their works legally within by making a change to copyright law, unless a rights holder opted out. And we'll get in. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment as well. So we at DACS, we were quite keen to make sure that our members were able to kind of engage with that survey, with that consultation. So we produced a kind of a set of recommendations for artists, and kind of enabled a sort of critical mass of artists and creatives to respond to that survey, particularly making the point that for artists, the idea of opting out your work is it's not really technically feasible at the moment, but also it takes up a lot of time. It requires transparency in terms of what's been trained, what works have been used to train AI models, and it's essentially reversing the principle of copyright. As I mentioned at the start, copyright as it currently exists applies to all of your work as soon as you make it. Unless you give someone permission, they're not allowed to use it for commercial use, unless there's exceptions for research, for example. So we produced a guide to that. We also obviously produced our own response to consultation. And the recommendations we made for that was that we need to keep copyright law as it is. We need to continue to develop a licensing market for the AI sector. So we need to facilitate a way in which artists can be paid for training of their work for models. So if models want to train their work on an artist's work, they need to be paying royalties to those artists the same way they would for any other kind of commercial use of copyright material. And then also demanding transparency. So again, as I mentioned earlier, one of the barriers to any kind of legal action around this is the lack of transparency, lack of visibility of training data. So it's not currently really possible for you as an individual or even an organization like DACS to see what these data sets are and to see what the training practices are. So you can't prove that a model is trained on David Hockney's work or Tracy Emin's work or anybody's work. So that transparency thing is really essential, really, to facilitate that licensing. And then also, I think during the debate, it became really clear, I think, that even for the UK AI sector, so sort of looking at smaller AI companies, so really some of the big players in this are mostly US based or Chinese based. So there's an appetite as well to develop smaller scale models which could work for artists. There are some quite interesting things out there as well, which we can perhaps talk about a little bit later, sort of artist-led models as well. So again, this is just sort of some of our recommendations that we made in the consultation. I can share these slides with you afterwards. I suppose also during the consultation periods, we were sort of thinking about how you could create a system which would work for artists. So how do you create a licensing framework which allows artists to monetize their work? So we brought together a group of artists, but also lawyers and those from museums and galleries, to look at opt-outs. So, if the government's saying we want to introduce a text and data mining exception with an opt-out mechanism, okay, how does that function? How does that affect not only artists, but how does it affect the custodians of their work as well? So, for example, if you're a gallery with an exhibition showing an artist's work, the artist has said, I don't want my work to be trained. I don't want artificial intelligence to be trained on my work, but the work is in an exhibition, and you allow visitors to take photographs of the work. The visitors upload the work to their Instagram. The work ends up back in the kind of circulation of training data. So really we were trying to make the point that, you know, the idea of an opt-out is extremely complex and would be really technically difficult to enforce. So kind of taking that broader sector view to that. We also looked at things like design patterns. So I'm sure we're all familiar with cookies and ads on websites, and how when you open up a website, it can be quite difficult to actually make the choices you want on the website, and you're pushed towards accepting cookies or accepting various kind of um, data policies. So we looked again at that. So how do you make sure that artists are actually able to make the right choices, or kind of it's easy to make the choice that you want to make? And from there, we produced a kind of model which we are sort of developing around transparency. So how you would actually, what you'd actually require from AI platforms to say, to be able to make the case of, okay, we can see that this work's been used to train this model. So, and again, this report can also be accessed on our website. There are also some kind of more direct things that we've been doing throughout this kind of the last 6 months or so. Yeah, really, yeah, 6 months. Which has kind of been to sort of galvanize the creative industries, particularly for us visual artists, but also kind of more broadly freelance creatives, by signing up to, we're part of a coalition called the Creative Rights in AI Coalition, which is the same coalition who got statements from people like Paul McCartney, Dua Lipa, Elton John, sort of saying, you know, this is really, really critical that we protect artists' rights in this debate, and that we enable people to still be paid. So as part of that, we produced a kind of letter template which you can all use to write to your MP on this. It's very, again, I can share this link around later, but it's a very quick template to use. It generates your MP based on your postcode. And we found that that approach has been really effective, because every MP in the country will have artists in their constituency, and this is a real concern for them. So we found that that approach has really helped to kind of move this debate back away from the kind of proposal for an opt-out, and back towards something which is more balanced and looks at the impact on artists for this. We've also produced a guide on our website that I can share afterwards, which is around, if you're using Instagram, for example, there are, again, this goes back to some of what I was saying around the kind of patterns and cookies acceptance and things. There are certain terms and conditions within Instagram's usage which you're signing up to essentially enable the Meta AI to be trained on anything that you put on your Instagram feed. So we produced a guide on how to basically opt out your work or your Instagram account from that training. So again, we think that's really important for artists who want to kind of remove that consent for training. So we produce a guide to that on our website, which again I can share around with you. So, you know, we're kind of hopeful that because of the strong response to the consultation, there will be some kind of legislation coming in at some point in the next year. But we know that in that interim period, there's a lot of anxiety from artists of how they can actually protect their work. There are no kind of perfect watertight solutions, but there are certain things that you can do to sort of protect it in certain contexts. So yeah, likewise, I can share that afterwards. And that's kind of just a very kind of top level, probably very acronym and number heavy overview of what we've been doing. So, but I'm also very happy to answer any kind of like more fundamental questions around generative AI, and I'll, you know, try and answer them as best as I can. But also kind of any more sort of general work around what DACS has been doing. Very happy to talk more about that as well. I'll stop sharing my screen now.